Morning, Year 9. We're going to have a go today at something new. We're going to look at a topic called quadratic equations, or a type of equation called a quadratic equation. Now, quadratic equations are special, okay? You've got to be able to recognize a quadratic equation. And so the first sentence here tells us how we can recognize quadratic equations. So a linear equation, so just our normal equations where we've got pronumerals and constants in them, where the highest power of the variable, so you'll remember the variable, most of the time we use x, but it could be any of the pronumerals, so it could be a in your equation. So the highest power of the variable is 2. So a linear equation where the highest power of the variable is 2 is called a quadratic equation. So it's one like this. You can see here I've got a pronumeral. My variable is x, but I've said x squared, and that's equal to 9. So instead of just being x equals 9 or x plus 3 equals 9, like the equations we've looked at so far, in a quadratic equation, you'll have a power of one of the variables being raised to the power of 2. So x squared equals 9. Here's a second example. So this one we've said 2x squared minus 6 equals 0. And because we've got this squared variable, instead of just being a traditional linear equation, these ones are called quadratic equations. Now you may say, what's so special about them? Now they're tricky because quadratic equations can have more than one solution. And so that means instead of just finding the value of x, you've actually got to find more than one value of x potentially. Okay, so in this case, if we look at x squared equal to 9, x squared equal to 9 could be 3. Okay, that's our first solution. 3 squared equals 9. However, we know negative numbers, when you times two negative numbers together, you also get a positive number. And so our second possible solution here is that x squared could equal negative 3. Sorry, x could equal negative 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 becomes positive, and the value is 9. And so we've got two solutions for these quadratic equations. So when we're dealing with quadratic equations, we've got to potentially look for not just one solution, which would be the normal case, x equals 3. We've got to look at both potentially the positive and the negative solution, because the squared means that we can get a negative times a negative becoming a positive. Alright, so we're going to have a look at a couple of examples of how to solve these. So the opposite, the thing you need to remember, is the inverse of squaring something is the square root. So you'll remember the square root symbol like that. Okay, so you've got to remember that when we go into the next section. So our first one is we're actually going to try and solve the example I've given you down the bottom, where I'm going to show you how to solve those two examples that I've given you here. So let's get rid of those, and I'm going to put x squared equals 9 is going to be our first one, and 2x squared minus 6 equals 0 is going to be our second example. Alright, so we said that the opposite of squaring, the inverse of squaring, is the square root. So if we want to get rid of the squared symbol, then what we've got to do is do a square root on both sides. So if I go through the entire working, we're going to do the square root on this side. So the square root of x squared, and that's going to be equal to the square root of 9. So the squared and the square root cancel themselves out on the left-hand side, so we're left with x being equal to the square root of 9. And this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, because we have to add a plus or a minus in here, because we know that the square root of 9 could be 3 or it could be minus 3. So what we normally do is just write a plus minus. As soon as we see that a quadratic, when we do this squaring and it cancels each other out, we just write plus and minus in front of the square root, because we know that it could be the positive or the negative square root of 9 that's going to give us our right answer. And so then we just say x is equal to plus or minus 3. You can write them side by side, so it equals 3 or minus 3, and you can do it in a combo answer like that. Now, this type here is nice and easy. If you can get the square the variable squared on one side and the constant on the other side, you can see that we can solve that fairly easily. This one here, we've got to use some of our algebraic skill to get it into this format. So the format that we're looking to get it in is our constant being on the other side and just being left with our x squared on the left-hand side. So the first thing that we're going to do is move any constants over to the other side. So to get this constant over here, I've got to get rid of the minus 6, so I've got to add 6 to the left-hand side. Whatever you do to the left-hand side, you do to the right-hand side. So I add 6 there. And so here I'm now going to be left with 2x squared is equal to 6. Then I know how to get rid of the multiplier out the front. Okay, what we want to do here, because it's times 2 times x squared, the inverse of times, or the opposite of times, is to divide. So I'm timesing by 2 at the moment, so this side I'm going to divide by 2. But whatever I do to the left, I've got to do the right. So I divide both sides by 2. And I'm then left with x squared being equal to 3. And so here, my next step, when I do my square root, I'm going to do the inverse. Remember, the inverse of squaring is to take the square root of something. And that's going to be equal to the positive and negative square root of 3. So don't forget, you've got to write your positive and negative here. Now the square root of 3 is 1.7 and then a whole lot of digits going on. So in this case, your final answer, you would just write it simply as x is equal to the positive and negative square root of 3. And then you'd be finished at that point. So remember, these are quadratic equations. Quadratic equations, the highest power of the variable is 2. Okay, and you've got to try to get them in the format where you've got your x squared on the left-hand side and your constants, your numbers, are over on the right-hand side. And then you simply take the square root of your x squared, just like that, square root your x squared. Remember to put the square root as a positive and negative value on the right-hand side, and you end up with your final answer. Now, if you can solve this final one, if this was just like this one here, if you actually knew the square root of 9 and it was a whole number, then you can write the final number, positive and negative 3. But if you can't find a nice integer value or a fractional decimal for the square root of the number, then you would just leave it in this format like that example there. All right, if you can please have a look at the worked examples there on pages 142 and 143. There's a couple more examples that you can go through and then have a go at your level box on exercise 2L. Remember, Year 9, stay healthy. We're missing you here at school and looking forward to you coming back soon, and we're praying for you and your families.